Welcome, quiet soul. You always hear what others miss. So today you are the listener history has been waiting for. You are Lola Montez, breathtakingly beautiful, dangerously sexy. At your peak, you didn't enter a room, you blazed into it like fire. Men dreamed of touching you. Women, they dreamed of slapping you just to soothe the sting of envy. You once cracked a whip before a king, making him stammer like a schoolboy catching his first glimpse of a woman's ankle. You once threw an entire government into disarray just by lifting your skirt at the right moment. You were not a woman of your era. You were the catastrophe it didn't know how to contain. And you knew it. You clicked your tongue, raised an eyebrow. Well, what can I say? Beauty has its price. And now, on January 17th, 1861, in a cold attic in Brooklyn, with winter clinging like an icebox, you are living the last day of your life. No audience, no spotlight, not even a half-crazy lover to serve as background noise. Just a rickety bed, the smell of camphor, and your bones clicking like a drunken musician, plucking the wrong notes of a final tango. You're not sick, you're decaying. Syphilis gnaws at your body like it's biting into a rotten apple, slowly, patiently, with an artist's precision. It doesn't need a knife, it has time. Your skin, once smooth like Spanish silk, is now mottled like a water-stained antique map. Your hand trembles as you reach for a glass of water, not from cold, but because part of your brain has forgotten which muscles to command. You smell ash. No one lit a fire. You're the one smouldering, burning from the bone outward. In front of your eyes, 39 years pass like a slow-motion film. No narration, no applause, only you and memories dropping like autumn leaves from a thinning mind. You hate this disease. Had you not caught it, perhaps you'd still be strong, still cursing the world in English, French, and gutter Spanish. Perhaps people wouldn't recoil from you as they would from a contagion. Perhaps you could still walk into a tea room and make fine ladies panic just because your dress had only one layer and your eyes carried the defiance of a goddess who bowed to no one. But perhaps is a word you never used. You lived, you laughed, you danced, until even dancing required someone to hold you up. You weren't afraid of death. What made your skin crawl was death without witness, death without remembrance, where no one recalls how fiercely you once lived. You once made a whole continent whisper. Now even whispers hesitate to say your name. And you understand what's killing you isn't only syphilis, it's memory, it's silence, it's erasure without manuscript. You look up at the ceiling. A crack, a spider, and an old question crawls up from your spine. Syphilis killed you? But exactly when did it begin? And before we dive in, I'd love to know, did anything in this story strike a chord with you? Stir your curiosity, drop a comment below. Who knows, your thought might just become the little treasure the whole community will want to dig up. You were born Eliza Gilbert, daughter of an Irish officer with dark hair, and eyes that asked questions no one wanted to answer. Your father died in India. Your mother remarried so quickly you barely had time to mourn. You grew up among brilliant sari sais behind silk curtains and the mingled scent of jasmine and colonial sweat. Their women were chosen not choosing, and a beautiful girl was a problem best married off as early as possible. At 16 you were handed to a British officer, a husband on paper, but in your heart he was a warning. He kissed you like a man inspecting a shipment fresh from the docks. You didn't cry, didn't scream, only thought, no, this can't be the rest of my life. And so you ran. No wedding dress, no farewell letter, just a small trunk, a pair of shoes fit for dancing, and a name you chose for yourself, Lola Montez. You weren't born an artist. You became a performance. Every turn of your body was an act of refusal. Every step onto the stage was a question whispered coldly. If I'm not a lady, then what am I? In London, no one knew where you came from. They only knew your dress was thin enough for the lights to pass through. You didn't dance for men. You danced to teach them the feeling of burning without ever touching the flame. Then he appeared. An officer, tall, young, with a small scar on his chin, placed perfectly to emphasize the cut of his jaw. He offered you a drink, then a night not in words, but in an unblinking stare. You had turned down dozens before, but this time you nodded. Not because he was special, but because you wanted to know where the woman you were playing would go next. That night there was no love. He undressed clumsily. You undressed like you were dancing. The blankets were lumpy, the bed rickety, but your eyes didn't flinch, your hands didn't tremble. You thought, if this body is an empire, then tonight I am its first invader. There was no pain, only a small catch like a tight dress finally slipping free. No declarations, no moaning, only damp silence and breath bitten back between your teeth. The next morning he slept like a child who'd won. You stood before the mirror, hair-tousled lips flushed a dark bruise on your neck like a backward kiss. You looked into your own eyes, not the gaze of a girl who had lost something, but the gaze of a woman who had claimed it. You walked out the door, kept walking. No turning back, no remembering the address. Only one thought repeated softly in your mind, velvet smooth blade sharp. Well done, Lola, now live a life worthy of that night. You told people you came from Spain. No one asked further. They only had to see how you stepped onto a stage dress, red like congealed blood hair, loose, like fire eyes sharp enough to know every secret they stuffed into their coat pockets, and they believed you were born in a land where the sun scorched honour, and women learned to dance before they learned to read. Every night you appeared was a heretical mass. You didn't bow to the audience. You stared at them long and hard as if checking who among them had the courage to burn. You didn't just dance. You scraped the floor with your heels, bent your body as if it hurt, then snapped back like a serpent shedding skin. They didn't clap for the technique. They clapped because they couldn't understand why their hearts were racing like fugitives. From Paris to London, from Vienna to forgotten towns where nobles sinned with ceremony, you crossed dozens of stages and hundreds of rooms, each one marked by the scent of your perfume, spicy sweet like a sedative past its expiration date that still had enough venom to bring men down. Some lovers were famous, some forgotten. Alexandre Dujarrier, Parisian journalist, the first to write about you with a voice both lovesick and bitter, as if every one of your dances slapped his rationality, was someone you almost loved. Almost. He died because of you, or because of his pride scratched raw in a stupid duel you didn't bother attending. Then there was Franz Liszt, the man who played piano like he was plucking your heart one note at a time, whom you never admitted to. Maybe it was him. Maybe just someone like him. But you remember that rainy night, the sound of a music bleeding through two doors, and his voice whispering in the dark, "You scare me." You left before he could ever write your name into a melody. The rest were men without names. A night in Lyon or Zurich or Palermo, cold lips, a neck that smelled of mint, a divorced general, an aging painter nearly weeping at the touch of your thigh, a nervous student begging to take off your shoes, then falling asleep at the foot of your bed. None stood out, none stayed long. You once tried counting, then stopped. What was the point when every breath felt the same, every moan melted into incense and silk? They called you a high-class courtesan, a goddess of debauchery, a bad girl who knew how to choose the softest bed. You didn't argue. But if they thought they were the ones driving, they forgot the carriage was already on fire the moment you climbed aboard. You thought you were immortal. When your skin was smooth lips, still red eyes still knew how to arch just enough to make a count blurt out a proposal who had time to think about consequences. White nights, short naps by the vanity, careless embraces, kisses as bland as water layered upon each other like lipstick never wiped off. You felt alive, too alive so much that sometimes you had to close your eyes just to breathe, because if you opened them any wider, you might see yourself lost. You never thought about illness, never imagined veins could rot, never pictured red sores rising like a curse from some long-forgotten night, never believed something smaller than a kiss could be stronger than a whole life. Your mind clung only to tonight and whoever waited behind the velvet curtain. Because Lola Montez had no future, only dresses, music and eyes ready to burn. And fire, as you already knew, has no fear of ash. Then one day among thousands just like it, you had a fever. Not violent, not writhing, just a sense that the air around you had turned slightly warmer, and the world began spinning slower, like a film reel lagging against your will. You remember the time, not precisely, but somewhere between 22 and 28, when your skin was taut like a chilled morning peach, and your gaze alone could make a Swiss banker forget his wife's name. You were afraid. Who wouldn't be when the body you lived by suddenly spoke back? You sat before the mirror, opened your blouse, touched your forehead, then thought, maybe. No, don't be foolish. You had seen Syphilis, an Italian noble who chased you across Florence, an English knight you slept with one night whose lips were blistered and red the next morning like acid had been poured on them. But you weren't like them. You were Lola Montez. You still laughed, still danced, still drank wine as if every drop were holy water, and you still made men die of thirst. It couldn't be you. Not a chance. And indeed, a few days later you recovered. Skin smooth, lips full. Your eyes sparkled like a full lake untouched by leaves. You wore a black dress, its V-neck plunging to where propriety had no language. You performed to a packed theatre, the aisles filled with flowers, invitations piled up. You were a flower in full bloom, radiant, fragrant, and if a breeze made your petals quiver, it only made them want to keep you for themselves. And just then, an opportunity appeared, not as an invitation, but as a test from fate. Rumours reached your ears about a powerful man, a true king, not a half-blood noble or a spoiled heir, but Ludwig III of Bavaria, an art collector, a beauty worshipper, and a monarch known for writing love poems to women during cabinet meetings. You didn't dance anymore, at least not for the public. You didn't need them. The stage had grown too small, the spotlight no longer wide enough to illuminate your legs. You made calculations not the kind dancers make when trying to become ladies, but the cunning of a fox who'd just sniffed out the path to the royal dovecote. You knew Ludwig adored beautiful women, but you were more than that. You were a woman who knew she was beautiful. You chose a dark blue dress, not red too blatant, not black too funereal. You bared your shoulders, but pinned a snake-shaped brooch to them, a warning that touching you might come with a bite. You prepared your act, not a dance, but a monologue about philosophy art, and the kind of art practiced in bed, the kind no one teaches at the academy. You weren't there to perform. You came to negotiate. In your mind, there were no more rented rooms, no ticking hours. You thought about the throne, or at least the seat beside it, where one hand would rest on the king's, the other revise the law. You didn't know that inside your body something infinitesimal had begun gnawing at your spine like incense burning from the centre of a scroll. You didn't know, or didn't want to know. You were dreaming big, and people don't stop dreaming just because their forehead feels warm. You were Lola Montez, and this time you didn't come to burn a crowd. You came to torch a kingdom. You didn't knock on the palace door. You walked straight in like you were born to be there, only passing through Earth due to a scheduling error. Courtiers parted like waves. Silk coats flinched like hens struck by lightning, and you in moss-green velvet breast, defying gravity hair, falling in deliberate disorder, walked down the corridor as if it were a runway lined with noblemen's gazes. King Ludwig said I was not like the others you had known. He didn't stammer, didn't lick his lips, didn't drop his wine when you sat down. He looked at you like a mis-sculpted bust, not ugly, just too real. Those eyes older than you expected, wearier than you hoped, but behind them burned a hunger unlike lust. It was almost metaphysical, as if he'd read about you in a forbidden book, and now could not resist the urge to study you in the flesh. He asked you one question once the room had cleared, like it was part of some sacred rite. Are your breasts real? You didn't laugh. You didn't blush. You leaned forward slightly, slowly pulled your neckline down just enough for the candlelight to flicker in his gaze. My lord, you're welcome to find out. Ludwig the King, who once read Goethe in Greek and copied love poems into his political notebook, gently placed 2 fingers on your breast. As if he were touching a curse he had just summoned himself. He nodded almost reverently. Magnificent. And just like that, you became the grand passion of an entire kingdom. It wasn't love like Romeo and Juliet. It was something else more complex, more irrational, a collision between incendiary beauty and weary intellect, between a king obsessed with aesthetics and a woman who refused to fit into any mould. You lived in the palace, not as a concubine, not as a queen. You were simply yourself, a sovereign being at the heart of power, and that drove the courtiers insane. You conversed with Ludwig about the French Revolution, about Byron, about sex and politics, as if they were relatives attending the same family dinner. Ludwig painted. You wrote poems for you, sculpted busts of you, and placed them in his gardens alongside gods. He called you the living Salome, the sweet ache, the most beautiful ending for an aging empire. But while the king adored you, the court panicked. Officials boycotted. The press mocked. The public whispered that you had bewitched him, that you were a spy, that you kept a serpent's tongue behind your teeth, or worse, that you had syphilis and still shared his bed. You smiled when you read those words, because the first part was true. The second, you weren't sure. Sometimes you'd wake in the night with a sharp pain in your hip like claws had raked through you, but it would fade, as always. The scandal didn't erupt from an act, it came from your presence itself. People despise beautiful women, but they fear them even more when they're smart. And you beautiful, sharp, defiant, unapologetic, were the biological embodiment of apocalypse for the aging aristocracy. Protests began. They painted you as a demon on tabloid covers. They forced Ludwig to choose the throne or you. He hesitated, then chose you for a moment. But thrones have claws, and you, though drawn to power, couldn't conquer a kingdom already trembling. Ludwig abdicated, and you, expelled from Bavaria like a fever breaking in the middle of a dream, were gone. You didn't cry, didn't stay to explain. You simply picked up your suitcase and walked away, leaving behind an aging king, a marble bust, and a nation that didn't understand why it felt hollow when you vanished. You had no idea that inside you Syphilis had already latched onto the shell of your legend and begun hollowing out the name Lola Montez. You spent some time in Paris, but Paris was no longer the Paris you knew. Old lovers had grown old. The newspapers had forgotten you chasing after a new maid who dropped her dress at the wrong ballroom. You stopped by London, where you became a late-night joke, Lola Montez, she's still alive. So you returned to the place that once dubbed you Europe's Scandal America. New York, 1851. No king, no throne, but full of newly rich men and women starved for something daring. You stepped off the ship in a dark violet dress, clutching a snakeskin suitcase, your face still carrying the weight of a continent tossed out of heaven, now touching down in the new world like a pioneer claiming untamed land. People looked at you. They weren't sure who you were, but they were certain you weren't ordinary. And so you began again another rebirth in the only way Lola Montez ever knew how, by playing with fire and dancing amid the embers still faintly burning. You gave public lectures, not on virtue of course, but on the art of seduction, who women should love, sleep with, and kick to the curb, and in what position. You wrote memoirs. You published a book on morality, something that made you laugh every time your fingers hit the keys. But the books sold. They sold fast. Because people weren't buying words, they were buying you. You still loved. Still slept with men you probably shouldn't have. Still stayed in the best hotels, drank expensive wine, wore rings the size of sugar cubes. But somewhere in the sleepless nights of Manhattan you began to feel that something wasn't quite right. One morning you woke and couldn't remember the name of the man beside you. Not because you were careless, but because something in your mind had slipped away. You quietly left the room, stepped onto Fifth Avenue, as if the night before had never existed. No one knew, but you knew, and you were afraid. Because you understood Lola Montez wasn't afraid of death. She was afraid of being peeled away from herself. You read about Australia while sitting on a hotel balcony in Manhattan, wrapped in Ludwig's old dressing gown, biting into an overripe peach. In the paper, the headline tilted just so Gold Rush draws thousands to the colonies. Names like Bendigo, Ballarat, Castlemaine passed before your eyes like a choir from a world you didn't know Red Earth. Sweat, blood, silver. There was something in the phrase Gold Rush that made you sit up slightly. Not the gold, the fever. Fever. The thing that had lived quietly in you through many winters, that whispered every time you sweated in the night for no reason but decay. Each morning your throat dry, your shoulders aching, strands of hair on the pillow like moss in an old leather chest. You once thought you were forged in fire. Now you realised fire could burn backwards straight into the marrow. You braced a hand on the pillow, stood up, felt your head tilt slightly. But your steps still had rhythm. Your heels still struck the floor with that familiar clink, and you knew you still had something left to auction off. No one invited you to Australia. No manager waved a contract promising glory. But you sensed a stage no one had stepped onto a land without an icon, and deeper than instinct you heard a strange calling like the flapping wings of an old bat lost in daylight. Lola, this is the final act, but not the end. That night you told the maid to pack. Mermaid-cut dresses, a few worn-down heels, a small sculpture of King Ludwig, the only thing you hadn't sold, though you once yanked diamonds from a necklace to pay for medicine. You packed a wooden box filled with love letters not to reread, but to remind yourself that once you'd been written in the hunger of men and the fear of women. As the steamer slipped past Hudson Bay, you stood at the bow, fingers gripping the railing. Salt wind seeped into your unpainted nails, your eyes fixed on the horizon, not for hope, not for resurrection, but because no one out there had ever laughed at you. And so you departed again, not to flee, but to see whether that faraway land still had the courage to look into the eyes of a legend burning herself for one last blaze. When you stepped onto Melbourne's soil, light rain fell. The wind carried the smell of red clay and coal, a scent no palace you'd ever danced in had known. Just a few days later, the local paper screamed Lola Montez, the Spider-Woman of Bavaria, to perform in Ballarat. You always knew how to bend the world's attention toward yourself, even when it was soaked in blood and mud. You rented a small theatre, loose boards, yellow light like melted beeswax. But when you stepped out in a black dress, barefoot eyes rimmed in shadow, no one remembered the nails coming loose beneath the floor. You began slowly, arms curling like smoke, then spun suddenly, leg slicing wide as if a spider's web had snapped down over the room. The spider dance. You arched back until it felt like your spine cracked. When you lifted your head, hair wild, cheeks flushed, eyes glowing like kerosene, the men stood as if woken from centuries of sleep. They clapped. They howled. They threw money handkerchiefs, torn bits of clothing. One miner smashed a beer bottle over his own head, blood streaming down as he shouted, "Lola, you're my gold mine." You became a sensation in Ballarat, then Bendigo, then Castlemaine. The press wrote Lola Montez the gold rush fairy who needs no pickaxe. But after the applause, you still coughed. At night, fever, a forehead burning like forged iron. You took medicine, then danced. Each time you collapsed backstage, it took you minutes just to breathe again. And then, the tomato, the Sydney tour. Rumours said you no longer danced like before. The papers wrote Madame Montez's exhausted scandal, and now her body can't keep up with memory. Still you appeared, lips painted, thick eyes sharp. But when you bent to pick up a handkerchief flung on stage, a ripe tomato exploded on your chest. You stood upright, didn't cry, didn't flee. You tilted your head slightly, looked into the crowd swaying between delight and discomfort, and said, "If you paid to insult me, at least use champagne. Cheap things taint the scent of disgrace." That night you packed. Not to run, only because here you had once lit a fire, and you knew no one burns twice on the same pile of ash. You returned to America. The ship rocked as if the entire ocean was coughing on your behalf. In your suitcase, aside from gowns, you carried a crumpled Australian newspaper, a critical article, though it still ended with a bold line. Lola Montez, the woman who made an entire colony swear because they couldn't stop staring. You kept it. Not because it was true, but because it was the last time anyone wrote about you. You returned to America in 1856. No reception, no headlines. Your hair had thinned. Heels no longer had steel. The name Lola Montez now recalled scandal more than desire. But still at every train station you held your head high as if you'd just stepped out of a palace. You tried many things. Acting, moral lectures, publishing memoirs. One night you stood at a podium before a women's society in Boston reading a speech on virtue and independence. The spotlight fell on your face. Some recognized you, the one who once danced before kings, enraged bishops, slapped reporters in hotel lobbies. They whispered. You smiled. That smile through all the fevers still curved sharply enough to pierce judgment. By day you wrote. By night you coughed. Sometimes the coughing tore your throat, brought blood. But come morning you still wore lipstick. Old habits, especially when they were survival masks. You lived in Brooklyn, a small attic with 2 windows and a tarnished mirror. Each morning you polished the glass, carefully gazed into it for a long time as if scanning the past. Not with pity, but to remember which gaze had made you fall and which had lifted you back up. The illness showed itself more clearly. Your hands trembled, vision blurred with the weather. One day you got lost in the street. They thought you were drunk. You laughed the kind of laugh only someone who'd truly been drunk could manage, and not from alcohol. In your final month you no longer left the house. A friend, a chapel matron, often came to read aloud to you. The Bible, sometimes Byron's poetry. But when she began to pray, you tilted your head and said, "Why pray for me? I lived exactly as I wanted. If God is real, surely he wouldn't want me to apologize for that." You lay in bed, hair, loose eyes, still ink dark, skin wrinkled, paper thin, but anyone who entered still saw something in you. Greater than illness, a quiet pride, a manifesto of living silent but fierce. Today, January 17th, 1861, you died. No family, no fanfare. A small paper reported Madame Lola Montez has passed from a stroke due to neurosyphilitic complications.